on the night of July 3rd, 2005. Sergeant Rico Williams and 8 other soldiers gathered in a park pavilion in the small town of Hohennecken near the Ramstein Air Base and killed 25-year-old Sergeant Juwan Johnson. Evidence presented at trial showed that Williams and others beat Sergeant Johnson with punches and kicks for roughly 6 minutes. The 25-year-old Sergeant Johnson of Baltimore had served the U.S. in an 18-month tour of Iraq, where he was seriously injured by a roadside bomb. He recuperated from his injuries and was nearing the end of his service in Germany, where he was stationed with the Army 66th Transportation Company. It was here he died at the hands of his comrades. Real quick, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. The channel has been in a slump the last few months, and this makes a huge difference. Also, consider joining my free Discord to learn how to make documentaries like this one, or like any of your favorite YouTube doc creators yourself. The U.S. military is a microcosm of society, and being so, the FBI estimates that 1 to 2% of the U.S. military belongs to up to 53 different gangs. That's 50 to 100 times the rate in the general population. Some gangs even actively encourage their members to join the military to learn warfare techniques. Prominent gangs like the Bloods, Crips, Black Disciples, Hells Angels, the 18th Street Gang, Mara Salvatrucha or MS-13, and the Vice Lords have a documented presence in the military bases, both domestic and international. But also, and more relevantly to today's story, the Gangster Disciples. In the dark and mysterious world of true crime, where every click could lead down a rabbit hole of intrigue, safeguarding your online presence is paramount. Enter Aura, the sponsor of today's video, and your ally in the fight against cyber threats. With cutting-edge military-grade encryption and an extensive global network of servers, Aura ensures that your digital footprint remains completely private, whether you're delving into the depths of infamous cases or simply browsing the web. Aura shields your IP address from prying eyes, preserving your anonymity and protecting your privacy. But it doesn't stop there. Aura boasts lightning-fast speeds and intuitive apps compatible with all of your devices, ensuring seamless connectivity, locally or abroad. Take control of your online security with Aura and browse with confidence, knowing that your data is safeguarded every step of the way. Go to aura.com/19xx or click the link in the description below to start your free trial today. For anyone that isn't familiar, the Gangster Disciple Nation is an African-American street and prison gang formed in 1968 by teenagers Larry Hoover of the Supreme Gangsters and David Barksdale of the Black Disciples. After years of war, the two rival gangsters united together to form the Black Gangster Disciple Nation. But since 1989, with Hoover serving life and Barksdale long dead, a lack of leadership caused friction between the two gangs. The BGDN is now divided into the Gangster Disciple Nation and the Black Disciple Nation. Both often get a mention in Chicago homicide reports or Chicago drill music. But far from the trenches of Southside Chicago, a sect of GDs had found camaraderie on an army base in Germany. A 29-year-old Sergeant Rico Williams had been stationed at Ramstein Air Force Base as an airman in the United States Air Force since around 2001. He was discharged for medical reasons in May 2005, but remained at Ramstein as a dependent of his wife, Octavia, who was also an airman. Not much info is available on Sergeant Rico Williams' background, but it's known that at Ramstein Air Force Base, he led a gang of soldiers and airmen in a sect of the Gangster Disciples, called the Brothers of Struggle. Williams had killed before, or so he claimed, and he made sure to remind his subordinates often. Though they didn't partake in any of the gangsterisms typical of Chicago GDs, members paid dues. Sergeant Williams was also known to collect members' families' contact information. They addressed each other not by their military titles, but by their nicknames of Ty, T, Rome, Ray, Set, Pee-wee, Dunk, Nicky, and, as Sergeant Juwan Johnson was known, J-Rock. There were 3 ways to join the Brothers of Struggle in Kaiserslautern: getting jumped in, a thorough sustained beating, getting blessed in, a special pass that only Sergeant Williams could grant, and lastly, getting boxed in. Self-explanatory. A jumping in was meant to be a test of heart and fortitude because there was zero tolerance for weakness in a street gang. Blows were to be landed with fists and only between the neck and the waist. The initiate was forbidden from defending themselves in any way. During the jump-in, initiates were asked repeatedly if they wanted to proceed. If they said no, the initiation ended. The BOS had performed around 15 to 18 jump-ins before J-Rock's, but no new member had ever been hospitalized or killed. Sergeant Johnson's mother had raised him to avoid the street life in Baltimore because she came from it and knew its pitfalls. On one of his visits home, she had him visit a street corner just to see how the same people he left hanging out there years ago were still there. To his mother and his wife, the mother of his 1-year-old son, he seemed like he had a good head on his shoulders and would never get involved in the gang life. But by the eve of Independence Day '05, J-Rock was now a prospective inductee to the Gangster Disciples and due for the beating of his life. That night around 8 p.m., 10 men and 1 woman gathered near a McDonald's awaiting Sergeant Johnson. After Sergeant Johnson arrived, the disciples hopped into cars, with one hopping on a motorcycle. They followed Sergeant Williams for 5 minutes down the road toward Hohenhecken. They parked at a pavilion down the path, unloaded and sat and waited for the clock to strike 9 p.m. Once it did, it was time to initiate J-Rock. The 12 made their way inside the covered, wooden pavilion. Headlights from some of the cars shined toward the pavilion to attempt to brighten the almost fully enclosed area. The GDs then circled J-Rock in the space surrounded by benches and a grill pit. Described as 6 foot tall and husky, Sergeant Williams stood in front of the 5'3", 185-pound J-Rock, with Ty and Rome at his side. T held a flashlight and a timer, not yet a GD. Letitia Nikki Ellis stood outside the circle. The jumping in ceremony began with Rico asking J-Rock if this is what he wanted. J-Rock responded with the "hell yeah." Sergeant Williams landed a right-handed punch to J-Rock's left cheek that knocked him out for 30 seconds. Pee Wee and Norman helped J-Rock to his feet. Again, Sergeant Williams asked J-Rock if this is what he wanted. The concussed J-Rock responded with a slurred yes. Sergeant Williams threw another vicious right that landed in the same spot, decking J-Rock a second time. J-Rock stood up under his own power, at which point 9 disciples converged on him. Years later in court, Nikki claimed that she thought only 6 GDs would beat J-Rock because the number 6 is sacred to the disciples. Their 6-pointed star emblem represents love, life, loyalty, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. The reason all the men present partook is still a mystery to Nikki. They pummeled J-Rock without a moment's respite. Before long, J-Rock could no longer stand. Infuriated, Sergeant Williams started to punt kick J-Rock's chest, at which point J-Rock curled on the ground in a fetal position and tried to protect his chest. The other members joined in kicking Johnson while he was on the ground. No kicking had occurred at prior jump-ins. Years later on trial, a BOS member testified that throughout the jump-in, whenever Johnson fell, he was asked, "Do you want this?" He would reply and say, "Yeah, hell yeah," or even "F yeah." The others picked J-Rock up and held him up, even turning him around so they could work on his back. After exactly 6 minutes and hundreds of blows, T called time, but he had to yell time 3 times before the beating stopped. The others heaved hard from exhaustion. They then embraced J-Rock in a group hug. He was officially a GD, but something was very wrong. He couldn't control his breathing, so they sat him on a bench and raised his arms over his head. There was talk of taking J-Rock to the hospital, but the consensus was it would raise too many eyebrows, and J-Rock himself said he was okay. They loaded him into his car at 10 p.m. and drove him 20 minutes to his barracks. There, they left J-Rock in the care of Army Private Florentino Cheris. J-Rock reportedly took a shower and returned to his room. Some of the disciples went to Black Sounds, a nearby club. Sometime later that night, Johnson asked to go to the hospital. Cheris first consulted with another BOS member, who called Sergeant Williams. Sergeant Williams said not to take him. Between 2 and 3 a.m., Sergeant Johnson called his wife, Kanika, and promised her that he'd be all right. He promised to call her back. Early the next morning, Nikki called Cheris to check up on J-Rock. He was okay. A little later, Cheris called back and told Nikki that J-Rock had turned blue and wasn't breathing. Cheris had found him slumped on the floor against a wall between his bed and desk. At 10:23 a.m. on July 4th, a German doctor pronounced Sergeant Jawan Lavelle Johnson dead. The cause of death? A hemorrhaging brain and heart. That afternoon, some of the GDs met for a barbecue. By then, they all knew that J-Rock was gone. Sergeant Williams cooked up a cover story. If anybody asked, a bunch of Turkish people beat up J-Rock in downtown Kaiserslautern the night before. Oh, and if anybody snitched, Williams said he would kill them and their whole family. No one doubted that Rico meant what he said. They had previously unwisely given him their family's contact information too. A few days later, Williams fled Germany and vanished for 4 years. The Air Force Office of Special Investigations will begin its investigation of the matter not long after. A SWAT team located Sergeant Williams in Chesapeake, Virginia in 2009. During the ensuing trial, Private Letitia Ellis provided an eyewitness account and the harrowing details of the events that night. She made a deal with the government in exchange for her testimony. In November 2010, Rico Rodriguez Williams was sentenced to 22 years in prison on second-degree murder and witness tampering charges. Williams was also ordered to pay $756,000 of restitution to Sergeant Johnson's estate. Williams was the sixth person to be convicted in this investigation. Airman Nicholas Sims, Army Sergeant Rodney Howe, Army Private Terrence Norman, Airman Jerome Jones, and Army Specialist Bobby Morissette were all convicted on varying charges and received jail time ranging from 2 to 12 years. Later in 2016, an appeals court reversed the murder conviction of Sergeant Williams and the restitution order as well. This was because the government prosecutor misstated a law during the trial. This court subsequently vacated the second-degree murder conviction and the restitution order based on that conviction. In 2017, Mr. Williams pled guilty to 1 count of involuntary manslaughter and witness tampering. He was resentenced to 8 years in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. The restitution amount for Sergeant Johnson's family was lowered to $100,000. Was it the 9 GDs instead of the usual 6 that ended J-Rock's life? The extended duration of the jump-in? Or were they particularly brutal on J-Rock for some unknown reason? Whatever the case, it's clear that by his own volition, a search for brotherhood and submission to a dumb hazing ritual ended Sergeant Johnson's life, miles and oceans away from his home and family. And that's the story of Sergeant Jawan J-Rock Johnson and how he was a GD for about 12 hours.